Let me introduce our speakers, starting with Rania Tadros, the managing partner in Dubai of INS law firm, Captain Mayed Almeri, harbor master at the port of Fujairah, Pradeep Rajan, senior managing editor, APPEC for freight markets at S&P Global Platts, and Faidon Panagiotopoulos. I'm sure, and many of these names, and that one in particular, once you go into 5 syllables, you lost. A senior trader at GMS. So I do apologize, Faidon, for not getting that correct. Please turn on your camera and your microphone, and we look forward to your insights. Welcome, and let's have Captain Mayed as well. Pradeep, if we could kick off with you, sitting in Singapore, the markets, giving an overview as we've done in the previous 2 sessions on the world year to date. There's been a massive opportunity. Containers, they've never made more money. They're more valuable than gold. Tankers, less so. What's been the shipping headlines, if you like, for 2021 in the first 3 quarters?
Thanks, Sean, for having me on this workshop, and I'm delighted to be here. Well, I think you asked a really, really good question. I think it's been an unprecedented year for shipping markets, and I can say it's also a phenomenal year as well. And if you look at sector by sector, as you said, containers, if you touch a container, it's almost like rubbing off a few smattering of gold on your finger, and then that's where the story really started. But at the same time, the dry bulk ships were not far left. They were not behind, isn't it? Containers are making around around $10,000 to $12,000, per TEU for shipping from Far East to North Americas. And if you look at the dry bulk markets today, across every sector of dry bulk markets, whether it's the Capesize or the Panamax, all of them are above the $35,000 range. But if you come to the tanker markets, and that's where the grief is. While our containers and the dry bulk veterans are having parties, whereas the tanker markets, they're grieving. The fact is that tanker markets, after the phenomenal contango play that we had in 2020, when oil demand destruction happened due to lockdowns, a lot of the ships which went into storage, with now crude being backwardated, those ships are being redelivered back to the markets, and they're adding to the supply side in the spot markets. And which is why today a VLCC, just to give you a bit of perspective, today a VLCC to move 1 metric ton of crude from the Persian Gulf into a port in China, you are paying only around between $6 to $7 a metric ton. And then that's really, really low levels. And VLCCs some of them are operating below the OPEX levels, the operational expenses levels. So they are in the negative territory. They're not making enough money even to run the day-to-day activities. Whereas there are a few ships that are eco ships, which are not many. Those ships would be just making break-even levels, and they would be able to run the show. But given the fact is that it's been a phenomenal year, but we would expect the tanker markets to come back quite strongly. We are starting to see the signs of it. Given that oil demand is back and OPEC has really not opened off its taps, we're starting to see a lot more oil from the Atlantic basin coming into the Far East. So what happens when oil comes from the Atlantic into the Far East is that you add to the ton-mile demand. You're moving 1 ton of oil at the really, really farthest distance. So if you're bringing crude from the Persian Gulf into the Far East, let's say China, that's around 27 days voyage. You're bringing crude from the Atlantic into the Far East, that's 45 days voyage. So you take a round voyage, it's 45 plus 45, 90 days, a ship is pretty much in an employment, and she's not out of the employment until the 95 days is completed. So, but whereas you do a trip from PG or the Persian Gulf into the Far East, the ship is back almost after 30 days or 40 days, So we are starting to see the ton-mile demand increasing because the supply side issues in the Persian Gulf, rather not enough OPEC supply out there in the market while demand is increasing. We are starting to see a lot of these Atlantic barrels, and they're adding to the ton-mile demand, and we're seeing slightly better freight rates in the VLCC markets or in the dirty tanker markets. And we could expect the same sort of a story even in the clean tanker markets, given that a lot of inefficient refineries, especially to be carbon compliant will have to sort of slow down their operations, and you'll have a lot more complex refineries out there. So that means there could be sort of lack of supply of clean products in a particular area, and you would start to see the clean tanker markets making longer hauls to supply those areas. So we would expect, give it, Q4 of this year, we're starting to see the sign, and Q1, Q2 of next year, the tanker markets will come back to party.
Faidon, if we might bring you in from a regional point of view, that global picture Pradeep has painted regionally, how has the shipping picture looked from the point? Obviously, are we the tanker market weak, which is not a good sign for this region?
Well, I think that Pradeep painted actually the real picture here, and what we are seeing, obviously, there is a two-level market, a two-tier market. Let me put it that way. You can see the bulkers and the containers, which had their long overdue recovery after, let's say, depressed rates, on the container sector, actually for the past 5-6 years. I can still remember in 2016, 2017, we recycled a 9-year-old container, which was quite an amazing thing by that time. But definitely there's a huge demand surge, especially with COVID providing this actually reboot of the markets. And tanker sector, of course, had very, very lucrative times, mainly the beginning of the COVID era, with all this huge demand and the oil production not being cut to the percentage that it should have been. So definitely all this oil flooding the market. Every trader went out there looking for a VLCC. Actually, ourselves were actually thinking, we had the proposal to refloat one of the VLCCs that we had beached in one of the yards in order to put it back in storage business. That was back in April. But obviously, the cycles cannot be predicted right now. And definitely all these tonnage with the oil prices increasing and going, as you very correctly said at the beginning of the session, in the region of $80 per barrel, all this tonnage is actually, the market is backwardated. And right now, this tonnage is being thrown back to the market. And we believe that recycling will be definitely one of the solutions. Actually, we believe that, and we expect that 2020 will be the year of tanker recycling, which we have not seen since 2018, when 42 VLCCs were recycled within 1 year only, effectively removing from the market around 13 million deadweight only on VLCCs, without counting the Suezmaxes, the Aframaxes, etc. So this will be a year of heavy tanker recycling. We already see this, especially on the bigger VLCCs, the FSOs, especially from the region here and Malaysia.
What about when demand comes back? We're seeing the forecast demand recovery to 100 million barrels a day in the first quarter next year. Will we go into a tanker shortage from a tanker surplus?
I think some of the writing is on the wall. I mean, if you let things play out for the next 6 months, and recycling also run its course on these vessels, and you can see that even Fujairah port is actually positioning itself in order to take advantage of higher prices. And I believe that the trade will be back, and the demand, as very correctly Pradeep said, will be there in the market to help this recovery of the tanker sector.
Rania, the shipping sector seems to have quite a turbulent COVID from the point of view of shortages, bottlenecks, the disruption, containers being lost all over the world, and yet we haven't even included the challenges coming with carbon, with the acceleration of the energy transition, and of course shipping is right in the crosshairs of that. How is shipping set up to meet these challenges, of which net zero by 2030 is not far away?
Yeah, I think net zero by 2030 is a very ambitious target, and the IMO hasn't suggested that that is a target that they're going to work towards. So I think the IMO is working more towards a 50% reduction of carbon emissions by 2030, and then perhaps something closer to the 100% by 2050. But I think whenever you're predicting things to happen in 30 years' time, you know, we've all learned from COVID that you can hardly predict what's going to happen in the next 2 years, yet alone the next 30. But shipping has a role to play in reducing the carbon emissions, and the introduction of low sulfur fuel oil a couple of years ago was the IMO's really first step into that. Obviously, the increased price of LNG at the moment probably isn't helping on that side of things, with people being slightly more uncertain as to whether clean energy is going to be affordable and what sort of clean energy they want to go to. But I think net zero by 2030 is not an achievable goal for ships. I think a significant reduction, probably in the region of 50% by 2030, is a much more realistic aim for shipping.
Captain Mayed, welcome as our host in this session from the port of Fujairah. How has the year impacted the port? And normal times, you would have, I think, around 18,000 visits a year from in your offshore anchorage area. How has the year been to date?
Yeah, in fact, the number of vessels that called Fujairah port offshore anchorage area last year was 13,147 vessels, and the peak was in 2017, where
Did Captain
at least almost 15,000 vessels. This year till date.
Captain Mayed,
can you hear me?
You were cutting in and out there. You were saying that in the peak year in 2018.
2016, where with the number of vessels, where the numbers reached almost 15,000 vessels at our Fujairah offshore anchorage area. But we can see that this year till date, we have almost the same number of last year, about 50 vessels short so far. But we still expect the total number of vessels to call the Fujairah offshore anchorage area by the end of the year to be almost over 13,000 vessels, similar to last year. And in terms of vessel movements, basically, we've seen an increase on vessel movements inside the port itself. So in the first 3 quarters of 2019, we had over 2,600 vessels calling inside the port, and this year we've seen an increase of 6% compared to last year. So basically, the vessels that are calling for cargo operation are more than the vessels calling for marine services at the anchorage area, and this is for basic reasons, basically due to restriction on crew change. On last year, we had the pandemic hit hard, mainly the crew change in our anchorage area, and we have an average of around 4,000 crew change activities in a month, and we've seen a reduction in that number starting from May this year, because there was a restriction on some nationalities to sign off vessels through port of Fujairah. But again, in last month or beginning of this month, this restriction was lifted. So we expect again the crew change to go back to normal figures, and the number of vessels calling the anchorage area will increase. So I expect the number generally to increase by the end of this year.
Deep on that point, how big an issue is that globally? The crew change, the mariners, seafarer mariners, predominantly coming from India and the Philippines. Generally, Pradeep, does it continue to be a problem? The COVID, the lack of vaccination, etc., that it is disrupting, or will it disrupt further?
I think that was a very good question that you asked, Sean. Currently, the main issue is not the lack of vaccine. The issue is the lack of travel. The travel restriction. The borders are closed. So if you're talking about Indian seafarers who would have, in the normal times, would have, boarded a ship around the west coast of India or around the east coast of India, or they could have been flown to Manila in Philippines and they would have boarded a ship. That kind of ease of crew change is not happening because of, you have the sporadic lockdowns, then, the country opens up, then you have suddenly a lockdown coming in. And that's number one, which is affecting the shipping market per se, because the crew change also delays the ship. And along with that, a lot of the countries where if you are receiving a cargo or if you are loading a cargo, those port states have brought in their own restrictions. For instance, if you take a ship to Australia, from the last, port of loading, the ship should have completed more than 14 days. the ship reaches within 10 days, then the ship has to wait outside the port, and what we call the OPL, the outside port limit, and spend another 4 days. So all this is adding to the delay. And then a country like China, which is one of the world's largest, receivers of ships, whether it's dry bulk, whether it's container ships, whether it's tanker ships, or they have come out with really, really, really tight measures. And today we have instances where in China, if a pilot has boarded a ship, he goes into a 14-day quarantine. So where do you have so many pilots, especially in a country like China, where ships are coming in every day or by the hour? So, and that's causing a lot of congestion and delay, which is also adding to the, the strength in the shipping markets. Because when you have a cargo and you don't have a ship making the right laycan, but you need to pay additional money to get another ship. So congestion is adding to the delays. Crew changes adding to the delays, and especially with the border costure, that's also adding to the delays.
Faidon, what can the industry do to coexist with COVID better? Because ultimately, this is going to be with us for a while. I mean, we might get, better vaccine rates, but what does the industry need to do better in order to coexist with COVID, do you think?
Well, first of all, let me state that I believe that the worst is behind us with regards to the issues that we faced back in 2020 with actually flights shutting down completely, countries and ports not accepting crew change at all. So we are in a kind of a better situation than a year back. But definitely, as Pradeep very correctly said, this is a very dynamic environment in which we operate. And when you buy or schedule a crew change, for example, on a vessel in a specific location a month ahead, you don't know if by the time the crew change is about to happen, you don't know if this will be possible or not. So I think that what we have been incorporating for the past year, not only us, but every owner out there, is the way forward. First of all, vaccination rates. I mean, we have implemented also a vaccination policy on the seafarers that will be joining and the crew change will take place. And definitely work simultaneously on plan B and C. Of course, this requires for you to have a firm schedule as a ship owner to know where your vessel will go, by when, have the alternatives there, but also work with the counterparties, either this being a seller or a buyer of a vessel, or this being even the charterer of the vessel, in where exactly, what are the interim ports that can possibly have this crew change taking place. So I believe it's a very dynamic environment, still has to be followed up closely, and owners and the counterparties have to think through this extensively. But I believe overall that we are heading towards the end of the tunnel at some point. I mean, I have heard these explanations that they expect by 2022, end of 2022, COVID, all going well, will be a thing of the past to some extent.
Rania, your thoughts on that, and is Faidon optimism warranted in the sense that this, from a logistics point of view, like Pradeep is highlighting, significant bottleneck disruptions, and we see that in the price of containers. Is this problem being addressed adequately, or what can be done better?
I think the problem appears at two levels. So it appears between the contractual counterparties, where I think it's being addressed reasonably well by people anticipating the risk that arises and agreeing between the owner and the charterer and the cargo owners who's going to bear the risk of delay. But I think where it's not being addressed properly is for the seafarer welfare situation, which is that the seafarer undertakes a lot of uncertainty, not knowing what will happen to them. There aren't really isolation procedures in ports. If one person is found to have COVID, they tend to put the vessel OPL for a prolonged period of time. That obviously increases the chance of other members of crew testing positive, and then you've got an extended period. So I think what we need is really a global protocol for seafarers, given that they operate globally, rather than having it very much dependent on the local state, a port state control. And you need to have like Faidon said, a plan B and a plan C, but that's at state level, not just between the two parties as to how they're going to sort it out commercially. A lot of companies, including ADNOC, have signed the Neptune Declaration, which is a commitment to support seafarers through this. Because other than the cost of all this, there is the mental health impact on the seafarers, who are often having been on board for more than they've ever had to be on board before, because they can't discharge the way they normally discharge. Their journey home is definitely going to be more complicated and more uncertain than what it ever was. And so I think commitment by the industry, but also by governments and states to their well-being is really important at this stage.
Captain, is that a point well noted? I'm obviously Fujairah. We live in a country of 7 emirates. There's federal government, there's each emirate has its own. We had a border between between Abu Dhabi and Dubai on land. These are added complications.
Not necessarily, because these issues which are related to health, for example, at the government level in Fujairah, for example, it's supervised and controlled by the National Crisis and Emergency Management Authority, which is a federal level organization. So it controls all these matters at the federal level. And we have the Ministry of Health and Protection, and they also look after it. But generally speaking, within UAE, we can say that we are helping a lot with the issue of crew change and making sure that, and even COVID cases and how we treat and isolate people on board vessels. To give you an example here, for example, in Fujairah, we have our certain protocol that if a vessel is infected with positive cases on board, then we allow basically the vessel to call the anchorage area, and we send the crew in the isolation rooms in Fujairah Port Medical Center. And if the case is, let's say, mild or asymptomatic case, then it's treated in the clinic. But if the case is moderate or severe, then the case is transferred to the government or the Ministry of Health medical facilities, where he gets treated until he recovers fully. Then he can go back to his ship, or even he can fly home. So we have certain protocols and procedures in order to help seafarers and vessels with COVID cases. But the main challenge for seafarers, basically the other countries in the region, that they still till date they don't allow crew change, and even if there is a positive case on board the vessel, they don't allow the vessel in, and so on. But we've been very helpful and cooperative with the shipping industry and ships in helping them to overcome this challenge of COVID-19.
It is ultimately, from the point of view of Fujairah or any port, whatever the challenge might be at any given time, the efficiency and adapting to new challenges. And one of them, of course, is the challenge of the move towards carbon zero, net zero on the fuel side. Let's bring up the survey question on that. And will ports like Fujairah and Singapore be able to retain their position as the world's leading bunkering ports without offering zero carbon fuel within coming years? I mean, the time frame on this, you could say 5 years, the decade that we're in, the 20s, that if you don't start offering zero carbon fuel within the 2020s, will you remain competitive as a bunkering center? Pradeep, your thoughts on that? Obviously, you sit in Singapore, generally world leader on many issues related to logistics and ports. Where do you see this issue going? 2030, zero carbon. Is the industry changing, adapting fast enough? Are ports adapting?
I think, again, you hit the nail on the head. In fact, the shipping industry is being forced to act fast. You have the IMO, International Maritime Organization, who's going to come up with legislation for starting 2023, when you have two regulations, CII and EEXI. So CII stands for Carbon Intensity Indicator, and EEXI stands for Energy Efficiency Shipping Index. So what does CII tell you? You need to reduce the carbon emission from your ship. So every ship will need to have a CII grading, where you start the grading from A to B and C and D and E, and D and E being the lowest denominated ratings. So any charterer who's out in the market to take a ship will look at ships that are being graded A, B, C. So that's really going to have an impact on the market. At the same time, ship owners are being forced to be compliant, because charterers have created their own initiative called Sea Cargo Charter, where you have the big companies in the industry. You have VTOL, you have Trafigura, you have companies like Anglo American. There are big other big companies like Some of the NOCs are there, Reliance is there. So all these charters or signatory to Sea Cargo Charter will not take ships that are not efficient, as well as they will not take ships that are emitting more carbon. But coming to the ports, as we all know that the market would head to methanol and ammonia. LNG will be a transition fuel. For the fact that LNG, if you look at its what we call the global warming potential, is much higher compared to every other liquid or any other marine fuel that you can think about, because the fact is that LNG, the methane slip, in fact, it takes almost 100 years to get away from your atmosphere. So LNG may not be the sort of the fuel of choice. That will be a transition fuel. But when it comes to port, I'm sure a lot of the ports in the world, including Fujairah, can be ready, given the fact that currently methanol is being supplied through over 100 ports around the world. So I think
Captain Mayed, let's bring you in on that question. Is the port thinking about this? Obviously, big bunkering hub, you adapted to the ultra-low sulfur fuel oil 2020 protocol pretty well. What about this?
Yeah, we basically welcome any new alternative fuel that wants to come into Fujairah and be part of the fuel mix in Port of Fujairah. We haven't been approached by any organization that wanted to have methanol or ammonia or hydrogen as an alternative fuel in Fujairah so far. But LNG we have received many companies that were interested to have LNG, but as you know that currently the infrastructure is not there. When we speaking about some of the fuel like methanol and ammonia, they are still premature actually to have them in the market yet, because they carry their own risks and safety issues. So maybe I don't see this is happening in the next few years, but maybe at a later stage, because the majority of the world tonnage is still burning either heavy fuel oil or shifting towards LNG.
Faidon, your thoughts on that? Is there time, or does Fujairah, in order to stay relevant, need to move quickly?
Well, it depends actually what time frame you're putting this, because if you're asking me about 2030, which has been discussed here, I mean, I don't expect 2030 to be a feasible, let's say, target goal for the shipping industry, mainly because, let's say, the majority of the vessels that are currently trading will be with us at least by 50-60% by 2030. So if we're talking about 2050 and onwards, then yes, definitely. But I think the question here and dilemma that the shipping industry is facing is actually not if there's going to be an investment. There's definitely going to be an investment on reducing the carbon footprint of the shipping industry. The question is which investment is actually the correct one. And this is a very tough decision that actually ship owners have to come to terms with, because it's a fast-paced environment. Regulations are always changing. I still remember 2020, the VLSFO versus HFO discussion, and there were several millions pumped up into the scrubber part of it. And definitely, I don't see this being a good return for the owners that made such a decision. And we have been facing all these different alternatives, like, let's say, as Pradeep said, LNG. But this is a chicken and egg story, actually. Will the infrastructure be there, and investment on the infrastructure will be there if the demand is actually not there from the part of the ship owners? And will ship owners actually pump money into new builds or retrofits if the infrastructure is not there to supply these bunkers? So I think this is $1 million question that the shipping industry is facing. And now there are other alternatives. We discussed methanol, definitely it's in the spotlight with Maersk, etc. But we know also that biofuels are eating to the capacity, probably carbon capacity of the vessel. So there are all these different aspects of it, and it's not a straight answer. But definitely, I believe that a shift to alternate fuels or transition fuels, as Pradeep said, is going to be in the books over the next 10 to 15 years, that's for sure.
Let's get the survey result and give Rania the last word here. 50-50 is the answer here. Do you need to make the shift in order to be a leader in bunkering? And there seems to be a mixed view on that. Rania, your thoughts on how important it is for a bunkering hub like Fujairah to make this shift in order to stay relevant. At the end of the day, the bunkering is the core of what brings 15,000 ships a year to Fujairah, calling at the anchorage area. Your thoughts on how important this will be going forward?
I think that from a bunkering perspective, the port has an advantage because ships take a while to build, and so it can follow the tracking of how many LNG powered ships are being built, and therefore is there really going to be that capacity need to satisfy them, rather than the hype that you get around when we talk about zero carbon. We have a lot of hype around methanol, around meth. How many ships are there? Do they trade to this region? These are the sorts of questions I think that a place like Fujairah and a place like Singapore are going to be asking themselves. And rather than having to speculate, they're going to have time to build their infrastructure in order to meet the demand that's going to be set up by these ships that are still being built. So when we look at the order books, yes, there are a number of ships in those categories at the moment under construction, and therefore these ports are going to have to modernize and be able to meet more carbon efficient fuels. But I think the key question, which wasn't put in your survey, is how long? Is this a 10-year project? Is this a 20-year project? I think we're talking over 10 years.
Well, we saw the IMO, Pradeep, being quite robust in their enforcement of 2020. There was a lot of, they're going to push the day, 2020 won't happen, but they held quite firm. And I would expect the same on this occasion, because over the next few years, carbon is going to become even more naughty word than it is even today.
Absolutely. You can see the sign of it happening now. The fact that you have the SCC, or the Sea Cargo Charter Initiative, proves the point that people are, on a unilateral basis, people are trying to be carbon compliant. All the signatories, the big companies, oil majors like Shell or Total, who are signatory to SCC, will be comparing their carbon emission levels among their peers. And they are the ones who are forcing the ship owners to be compliant. So the pressure is not coming from either the government or anyone else, but it's these companies who are the big boys of the chartering world, and they spend multi-million dollars in chartering ships. So they're putting pressure on the ship owners, and the ship owners are being forced to come to the party, or are forced to.
What is Singapore? What is Singapore doing, Pradeep, regarding ammonia or these other new carbon neutral fuels?
Yes, Singapore has actually made some headway in the sense that they're thinking about starting methanol bunkering. The reason I mentioned about methanol bunkering is that recently there was methanol bunkering that was done in Rotterdam. You can use the existing infrastructure. You don't need a specialized bunker barge. You can use the existing bunker barges, just that they need to be clean. And so methanol seems to be the easy way out. And Singapore, being a sort of like a petrochemical hub as well, will push for methanol, as well as already it is doing quite a lot on the LNG side. And of course, ammonia is a little bit too early. The fact is there's a lot of development that's happening, especially ship engine makers like MAN and Wärtsilä. These companies have already started to work on these ammonia engines. But it's early days, but methanol, Singapore, I'm sure, will have a sort of a first mover advantage or a second mover advantage after Rotterdam.
Well, that is where we need to wrap up our session. I'd like to just give Captain Mayed, as our host from the Port of Fujairah, the last member of the Port of Fujairah team on this workshop, to just give us some closing thoughts on the overall sessions and what he's heard today.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thanks for this knowledge sharing workshop. And it's good that the thoughts and the ideas that we heard from the participants, and I thank them all for their inputs, and I thank you also, Mr. Sean, for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Mayed, and thank you to everybody, and we send our best regards to Captain Musa, of course, the Managing Director of the Port of Fujairah, and wish him well. We will be capturing all of the salient points of the workshop, and we will be formatting them into a white paper that we will share with everybody. And we also thank the 150 people who logged in to watch and listen to the 3 sessions. So have a great day. We look forward to seeing everybody in Fujairah for the Energy Markets Forum in March, which we postponed for 6 months due to the obvious challenges with COVID. But we are looking at the March 14, 15 for our annual, the 10th anniversary Energy Markets Forum in Fujairah, and hopefully we will see everybody in person, shake hands, exchange business cards, make some business development relationships, and continue the great work and progress of Fujairah as it moves forward to become one of the most important global energy hubs. All the best, everybody. Take care and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.